Thank you for introducing me. When one of the things I was asked to do today was to kind of review adult protective services, and so some of you are probably familiar with this, so hopefully for some of you it's a review. But I think it's important. It's an important conversation for us to have and kind of make sure that we're following what we considered elder abuse cases. So I'm unusual in the sense that I work at the Attorney General's office, but from you heard from my bio, I'm not an attorney. I learned a lot about the systems and social services and elder justice. Actually, prior to becoming the chief supervisor for 20 years, I was what I would consider a mandated reporter. I worked in the community-based services like Passport with the Western Reserve and Benjamin Rose, then jumped into adult protective services. So I had a strong background. And now with the Attorney General's office, I had kind of taken the turn of also learning how elder crimes are looked at, and there's some overlap between that. The reason the Attorney General created this office is because in Ohio, we have a very fragmented elder justice system, and we have many systems, and they do different things, and there's some overlap. So I think sometimes it can be confusing for professionals as well as victims trying to figure out where to turn to. So that's really where why I enjoy what I'm doing right now, but why the Elder Justice Unit was created within the section of the Ohio Attorney General's office. So I would like to get a little bit of a sense of who's in the audience, but also have a poll question, is because I was hoping to get a little bit idea of from you as far as what you would like to get out of this time we have together. So I'm hoping to provide some general information that help you identify cases and reporting of elder abuse, as well as information of addressing common challenges, because we are talking about adults, and information about what happens when the report is made, because oftentimes that's important for you to understand as a mandatory reporter what information you're entitled to, what information you're not entitled to, as well as what happened to the case. I know it's very frustrating for mandated reporters when they don't know what happened. And then lastly, I want to review and hopefully give you resources for you and information as to what to do besides calling APS. What are your resources? So it looks like from the poll, so far I've got 7 out of 15 folks have responded, and looks like I'm going to give it one more minute, or a few more seconds, I should say. Maybe looks like the majority of you would just basically would like to know the first one, to learn general information about how to make reports. And then there's a few folks that that want to know more about what happens when the case is made, and then about the additional resources. No one at this point wants to learn how to handle challenging cases. You must know that already. But I'll probably end up reviewing it because in the learning objectives, they kind of matched with that question, obviously. So basically, I want to review today some of the revisions to the laws so you're familiar with them. I want you to be more familiar with what's required from you as a mandatory reporter, including immunity and what's in penalties related to failure to report. And then we're going to end up talking about victims, because adults have rights, and so especially in America, we have to address when we're dealing with people's choices and lifestyles, because that impacts what happens after you make the report. And then because of that, I'll end up touching what I consider is critical to APS and any type of investigation involving adults are issues around capacity, competency, and self-determination, because people, in the way even the law is written, people have the right to accept services as well as refuse services. And I know that's also a bone of contention, and I have heard people say that actually affects why we report cases. Like, why should I call APS, or not going to do anything? Sometimes it's really about the person didn't want help and there wasn't any information to go forward. So we'll talk about those things. I'm going to leave room at the end for questions. So hopefully, as we go along the information, if something comes up, and keep your questions so we can address them at the end. So the reason this conversation is so important, and it's important to have and review, I think we should probably do this at least every year. We talk a lot about the new mandated reporters, and getting the information out. But I know that when I was young in school, I didn't receive any formal information about what's required in being a mandated reporter and how to make reports. And I don't know if I'm the only one, if there's others out there who did never receive formal training. So I think this is an important topic to remind people, but I also think it affects why we are so underreported. So the old days, we used to use a stat that was 1 in 5 would go unreported. But I know that there's other studies that have happened, like there's one out of New York, it was called Under the Radar. They said that in exploitation cases, it's as much as 1 in 43. So what I can tell you is that as a group, we are more likely to not report and talk ourselves out of making the report than we are to make the report. And because of my background, I'm a fan and an advocate of, if you don't know, call it in, because that's the intake process really, is to help us screen. If you have enough information, the case will be screened in. And if it's not, then you at least can document that you made the call and you've made an attempt to try to stop it. Because the other thing I say a lot is, if we don't call attention to it, it's not going to stop. So calling APS or calling attention to the case provides an opportunity to do something and stop it. It's obviously, there's no guarantee. It's basically creating an opportunity. But the one stat that I have up there that I think is real important, people don't realize, is that victims of elder abuse are 300 times more likely to die than someone who's not been abused. And that to me is a staggering figure. And it also brings to it really punctuates how important it is for us to try to do something, because obviously the victims are suffering. And in Ohio, the problem's getting bigger, not smaller. Ohio is a very highly dense populated state of people over 60. And matter of fact, in the Scripps studies are saying in 2040, we're going to have more seniors turning 85 than kids turning 18. So the other thing we're seeing is a shift in demographics. So we need to, problem's not going to get smaller, it's going to continue to grow, which is why I talk about this so much. So I just mentioned to you that it's underreported, and the truth of the matter, it's underreported by everyone. It's not just victims typically won't have a hard time calling and drawing attention to it, but it's also a situation where we have professionals who are mandated reporters sometimes fail to make the report, and as well as people who are not mandated. Ohio does allow anyone to make a report. So there are there's a list of professionals that are listed, and we're going to talk about in a minute. But the reality is we're all protected. Anyone who makes a report is protected. So it's not just for the mandated reporters. So it's largely a hidden problem, and it's another reason why we have to keep talking about it in order to, and most likely victims are not going to come forward. It's really up to us to try to identify the risk factors and what we're seeing, so we call attention to it, because very few older adults will actually come up and tell you that they're being victimized. If they do, we do want to take it serious, and even if we know they might or have concerns about dementia or capacity, because I'm telling you that that's not the norm. The norm is for them to hide and protect their independence because of their shame. So they typically don't come forward. They really rely on people like us to identify the problem. This is an interesting article, and one of the reasons why professionals aren't reporting. Some of it is because the signs are subtle. People that are, for instance, on medication like Coumadin and other medications, maybe the bruises can be attributed to a medical condition, or if they have, if they're taking a medication that causes bruising, or as I mentioned, if they ask their victim, sometimes I've talked to professionals and they tell me they think they need permission of their victim. So we have to explain, no, you can make this report. Matter of fact, you're mandated to make the report if you see the symptoms. It's not, if they deny it, you can mention that in your report that you checked it with them and they're denying it, but these are the things you're seeing, but it doesn't protect you as a mandated reporter. In Ohio, we don't make the report sometimes because we don't know who to call. Is this a situation where we involve APS? Is this a situation that should be called into law enforcement because we believe a crime occurred? Is it domestic violence and we should be using that system, or is it mental health? And so sometimes we get bogged down with who should we call, who should we be calling, and so the call doesn't get made. That's another reason why this is important today. And then the one I hear a lot, especially with professionals who are working with their victims, sometimes people are afraid that if they make the report, it's going to affect their relationship. The victim's going to stop working with them, or you're the only one that has, you're like a gatekeeper, you're keeping an eye on the situation. And if you report it, what happens if they then no trust you and now you don't, there's no one looking. So those are some issues that sometimes are ethical issues and sometimes will interfere with making the report. Why victims don't report, I kind of mentioned this already, they not only do they not report, but they're driven by a lot of fear of loss of independence. In our society, we do a pretty good job of, when we want to protect our seniors, you know, sometimes it involves removing them from their home. And that's something that's like the last thing they want. So they're afraid to tell us, because if they tell us our idea of helping him is somehow we're going to put him in a nursing home, we're not looking at other options. And they, because of the fear of it, loss of independence, they don't want to tell us. Or they're living with their perpetrator, or they're very dependent on their perpetrator. So now if they tell us and we don't do anything, and here they're going to be staying in that relationship with their perpetrator. So the fear of retaliation drives many times why they don't cooperate with us, why they might recant their story. So it's real important that we address their safety. And when we're making the call, that sometimes we want to organize a safety plan, because it is true that if they're living with their perpetrator, that there could be a fear there. So we want to be careful with that. A lot of times our clients don't know. So that's one of the reasons we have to talk about capacity. It could be they don't know because they have capacity issues, dementia issues, but it's also sometimes they're flat out lied to. So a lot of the things I do when I'm working with investigators and law enforcement is really looking and talking with them about under what circumstances did the person agree to this, because we have to find out if they were lied to, or were they intimidated, or was it flat out intimidated to, or even their fear because they've been physically assaulted because of, so they're afraid of their perpetrator. And then emotional independence on the perpetrator, that's important, because you see a lot of times where there's a relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. Usually, oftentimes, the victim has resources, but they have dependencies in their ability to care for themselves. The perpetrator has the ability to provide care and look as a caregiver, but they don't have financial resources. So that's a very challenging connection to deal with. And then, as I mentioned, you have dementia and other related cognitive disorders that keep people from making the report or understanding what's going on. I want to talk a little bit with you about victims, because in my position in the Elder Justice Unit, I'm not representing systems. One of the things that I do in my system is try to represent the victims, and victims suffer when we get lost in the different systems and who's doing what and how do we qualify them. And matter of fact, one of the biggest reasons the Elder Justice was created was to help increase the prosecution of elder abuse exploiters and abusers. What we found in our efforts initially is that these cases weren't coming forward. So this is one of the reasons why we have a very large outreach effort, is because if we don't identify the victim, we can't prosecute the bad guy. So it really, outreach and getting victims to be comfortable with us and coming forward, but also teaching the professionals how to identify cases is really important in order to identification is the first step to solving the problem. So finding them and having them come forward is why I'm here today. So I can tell you that the study here about a typical victim, it's right now in Ohio and even nationally, the figures are basically that most 60% of our victims are females. And why is that? There's a couple of reasons. One is women live longer. I know that stat's changing as women work, and some other reasons, but the resources, and this is a common problem, a lot of times the resources are exhausted with the male. So by the time she reaches a certain age of 80, she has less resources and therefore becomes more vulnerable to having someone taking advantage of them. And then we also know that the more dependencies you have, the more physical reasons, the more impairments that you may need assistance with makes you vulnerable. So those are, we also see the opposite. So people living alone have a higher risk. And right now there's some studies being done addressing not just isolation, but loneliness, because you can actually be in a household and still be very alone. Lots of research being done right now, especially with COVID and what's going on with aging, with safety in place, is that the people who feel alone and are alone and don't have resources to connect other people become, that in itself is a huge issue with becoming vulnerable. So we also see it with folks that have a lot of family members. But so I had a case the other day. It was a case in an outlying county where she's paying for the house, she's paying for the cars. So she's the only, no one works in the house, but they're all living off of her income. So it came to light. That was an interesting case because she actually called 911 and had the police come out because that's how she was discovered. She was sitting in, it's her house, but she only gets to have one room, and it was a lift chair that she was actually living in. So I was like, we better grab that chair. But it's actually a difficult case because not only is it a case of exploitation, in Ohio, APS is civil, so neglect under the civil law is not a criminal action, but there is a criminal code called failure to provide for a functionally impaired adult that can be charged criminally. So one of the things that case, we're actually looking and having law enforcement and adult protective services working together, which is important because the civil side, APS, is looking at how to provide protected services, and then law enforcement can address whether or not we can hold the bad guy accountable. But I'm curious to see how that case turns out because right now she is in a facility. She went there as a rehab, and at first it was being seen as a neglect case, and now they're realizing to what extent the son was taking advantage of her financially. And this is a good case where she, even though she has dementia, she reported to everyone that she thought her son was stealing from her. And I'm like, we better start talking to her and take it seriously because, again, they usually don't do that. Older adults are oftentimes motivated by wanting to protect their family members, and they want to be the good parent. And this slide is reminding us when we speak with them in terms of what do they want. So what's a successful case for us, for instance, might not be the same for them. This affects the type of safety planning that we want to offer our older adults. Sometimes they want to, and oftentimes want to continue to have a relationship with their family member. They just want us to stop the abuse, and that can get very challenging. But that's one of the reasons why many times in older victims, the cases, the safety planning involves providing protective services in the home versus a younger woman's, usually the safety planning is in removing herself from that situation. But that makes it hard to work with them. I do think it's important to talk a little bit about self-determination because as I mentioned to you earlier, in our country, adults have the right to self-determine, and the way the APS law is written, it actually spells this out very clearly that adults have the right to receive protective services if they're deemed necessary, but they also have the right to refuse services. And this is why sometimes cases are investigated, and you might get frustrated because she continues to live at home with her drug addict, the perpetrator, and you're asking why. It's like, well, you're dealing with, this is what they want. So it's, unless we have proof, and we're going to talk about that in a second, in order for APS to move forward, there has to be proof that the person lacks capacity. And that's important. But in terms of self-determination, and I remind people this all the time because you hear folks, well, they're choosing to do this, depending on the case and the risks that are being perpetrated and what's going on, the harm to the adult, the risk of the harm. I typically, if I get asked to chime in on a case and provide a consultation, I oftentimes ask questions around self-determination. And one of the things I bring up all the time is the issue of capacity. Someone has a question? I thought I heard. The issue of capacity, and then of course, whether or not they've been unduly influenced. So people associate undue influence with someone who's incapacitated, but it's actually anyone can be unduly influenced, and it's easier to trick someone and deceive someone if they have capacity issues. But I've had lots of cases that the person was manipulated. So they made decisions. So on the surface, it looked consensual. And it wasn't until you start digging that you find out that all the circumstances that happen, how I call it setting the table. The bad person, the perpetrator, provides the information to motivate the person, or they limit access to information so they don't, they limit their, I had some severe case recently where the older adult didn't have access to a phone. They didn't have access to TV, so they have no connection to the outside world. So their reality was really orchestrated all by the perpetrator. So it looked like she was making those decisions, but those decisions were being made with only partial information. That activity of undue influence and capacity can undermine self-determination, which is why in some of these cases, I definitely push for us to do evaluations, because I want to make sure, is someone else influencing them, or are they really making those decisions on their own? So this, so how do we know when we have consent and when we don't? And is the person able to understand the benefits of the intervention? I know those of you in the medical field are familiar with these type of attributes when you're looking at making decisions around care. But it can also be utilized to making decisions around whether they're accepting protective services. And having those conversations and sometimes lead to formal evaluations, because we really want to find out if they're really understanding and appreciating the consequences of the decisions they're making or not making. So it actually affects, from a legal perspective, whether or not the consent is valid. And so if the consent was obtained, as I mentioned already, by either force, or they've been lied to, or they've been manipulated, it could be challenged legally as not being valid, as well as I mentioned, whether the person has capacity or if they've been unduly influenced. That under those circumstances, you do not have legal consent. And that's important, especially when we're looking at victims and what's going on, because many cases are dropped, whether it's APS or even law enforcement, because you have a victim who's not cooperating with the investigation or doesn't understand that they've been victimized. And these elements that we're talking right now are actually topics that I spent hours talking and training, because today we're just talking as an overview. If you wanted to learn more about this, it would probably take us a whole day in itself. The other slide that I like to review is the difference between capacity and competency, because we use these terms interchangeably. I even find myself sometimes using them interchangeably, and they're not. They're connected. I remember one of my judges that was on our coalition, he used the term, the capacity and competency are kissing cousins. They're not the same. They're connected, but they're not the same. And typically, when we're dealing with our clients and our adults, whether they have the ability, I have to remind everyone that, we're not really, in most of these cases, we're not really talking about competency, because in Ohio and in our law, we're all competent. We're all competent until the judge says we're not. And usually what we're talking about are capacity issues. And severe capacity issues can lead to us questioning competency and having people evaluated and going through the court process. But really what's going on is their ability to make incompetent people can have capacity issues. If I'm a diabetic and I'm not taking my medications properly, that could influence my capacity. If I, as you all know, if I had some type of infection, I could be competent, but now I have changes in my mental status that can be considered incapacitated because it's related to either medications not being provided correctly or withdrawal of medication. Those are things that can affect my decision making, but it also, in those situations, I can actually be more vulnerable. So which is why I push for, if I see a situation and the harm is high and the risk, I ask to see if there's been an evaluation done. because there's a certain point where we need to stop assuming capacity, we need to stop assuming competency when we see the victim being taken advantage. And I'm not talking about every case, I'm talking about when there's a severe consequences and the person's unwilling and they're uncooperative. I'm going to go here and ask these questions and see if there's a way we can help them, because we want to find out what is their true functioning. I don't want everybody incompetent. I want to know what they're able to make a decision for or not, because that's going to help us going forward. So the interview questions and these, you know, we can't just ask someone, you know, what are you, what, you know, are you being abused, you're being neglected, are typically not good questions, or too direct, and it's too easy for them to deny that. So I do encourage, and we do some trainings around what kind of questions are appropriate, how to ask, because you want to find out, for instance, when we want to find out about their knowledge. I just mentioned to you, consent means that I knew what happened, I acted on my own. So I'm going to ask questions related to, for instance, if I saw someone that has a new power of attorney, how did you come to get the new power of attorney? Whose idea was it? How did you get introduced to the attorney? Because I'm trying to find out if this is something they did on their own, or is it something that was influenced by someone else? You're going to get a better idea of what's going on when you're asking questions that are designed to get the person to talk to you about what's going on, and not just flat out say, is someone hurt, is someone abusing you, because, or someone exploiting you, because it's easier for them to flat out just say no, and we're going to stop asking the questions we need to ask. So in terms of exploiters, I always like to tell people, bad guys like to lie and cheat. Bad guys are good at tricking professionals. So sometimes we end up colluding with them, because the bad guy, you know, some of you might call them caregivers, I call them perpetrators. Sometimes they're very good at blaming the victim for what's going on, and sometimes they're very good. So I always say to people, watch out for things like, I'm doing the best I can, I'm just trying to help out, and to try not to, when they're making it about themselves, it's usually a flag that, you know, because we should be focusing on the victim and what services they need and aren't getting, and they need to make sure that we focus back on what the person needs. And one of the things that I like to say about exploiters is that some of them are not intentional. Folks that don't mean to do it typically respond to you talking to them about resources and putting services in place. If it continues and they're unintentional, sometimes I find out that my caregiver is a victim themselves. Sometimes, you know, we view them as a caregiver, and it turns out they're a victim as well. Or that's how we find out we're dealing with an intentional caregiver, is because they don't really want the situation to change. They want to continue to control the situation. So you don't really find that out until you start asking questions and getting them and providing resources. I know when I was the chief of APS, I used to tell my workers all the time, you know, we're going to offer services, because you're either going to solve the problem, or you're going to start realizing you're dealing with an intentional caregiver when they don't because they don't want the situation to change. They're benefiting from it. So anyone can be an abuser. In APS, we usually tell folks the stats that typically in adult protective services, they know the person, they have a relationship with that person. So it's someone they know, a family member, a caregiver, someone that they know and trust, because what's happening is that trust that's been created is now being exploited. The one thing that that I'm seeing more now that I'm in my position at the AG's office is, you know, we also deal with con artists and scammers, because they're using some of the same tactics to take advantage of the individual. But con artists and scammers are a little different, but we're going to talk about them in a second. I talked about this already. This is just your slide in terms of looking in red flags, in terms of that relationship that exists between the two. It's usually not an even relationship. Someone's usually benefiting from it. And those are red flags that I look for, especially if someone's unduly influenced. I had a case where the gentleman gave his house to his home health aide. She met him initially as it was a professional relationship. Once she found out what his assets were, she ended up leaving the agency And this is where you find too sometimes is that she went rogue. She went from working for the license to be convincing him to hire her privately, because then there's less oversight. But it's a red flag when someone wants to leave their assets and his house to this person as opposed to his family. And luckily in that situation, somewhere along the line, a professional had done an evaluation and filled out a statement. They never acted on it, but it was easier for us to realize that he had capacity issues. So we were actually able to use the old statement to have proof of capacity to try to get a new evaluation. And of course, we were able to find out that he actually needed a guardian, but it was how we were able to sever that relationship with this aide. So we're going to talk a little bit about reporting adult protective services. So I have a polling question that I want to ask you before I keep going. Because I want to know a little bit about you and what settings you work in. So are some of you working, are you working in the community-based services? Do you work in an acute care setting? Do you work in a rehab? So every nursing homes, assisted livings, and then some of you might be working in all different types of settings. So I'm giving you a little bit more time. So do you work in a community setting? That seems to be, looks like the two highest ones are community setting, and those of you who work in different settings. So I'm assuming if you're working in different settings and you're going into facilities, or you might be going into a home or a group home. And the reason this is an important question is because, so here's the results. Like I said, about half of you work in the community, and then we have a few folks working in acute care, nursing home. And the last one that you have to, so if you work in the last one, you have to work in different settings. You have to know all the laws, because your patient it's going to be different depending upon where the person lives. So in Ohio, we don't have a one-stop shop. We're one of the few states that APS, for instance, does not have the authority to investigate in any long-term care facility. So it's not just nursing homes. Adult protective services also are not able or allowed to investigate cases in assisted livings. So for them, it's in Ohio, it's restricted to folks that are living in the community. Now this can get tricky, because some of you who work in a rehab center, for instance, if that person actually lives in a facility and they're when they're with you, they're a patient. So you can technically have access to adult protective services, because the person you're helping is a patient. They don't reside there, they're a patient. So their goal is to get them back into community. So you would be able to make a report on a case that was someone who is rehabbing, or same thing with hospitals, because we have this conversation all the time. If someone's in a hospital, people don't live in a hospital, they're patients. So technically, adult protective services has the authority to investigate in facilities like that. If someone is the ombudsman, I wrote facility there, but long-term care ombudsman is actually responsible for long-term care residents. And so with waiver programs like Passport and some of these other programs, the ombudsman can actually be involved in that as well as APS. But typically we think of long-term care ombudsman when the person's living as a resident and living in a facility, either assisted living or a nursing home. The Ohio Department of Health is an important one, and I work with them all the time, because if the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, is a staff person, or I don't believe the facility was providing enough supervision, and they're supposed to self-report, but sometimes they don't. I make reports to the health department if the person is in the facility, especially because we don't have a lot of choices. If they're living in a facility, I'm going to be working with the long-term care ombudsman, the health department, and then if I think what happened reaches to the level of a crime, then I'm going to make a referral to the healthcare fraud in my attorney general's office, because I know that they're looking at cases like that meet the level of a crime. So it's just like asking law enforcement to get involved. Our healthcare unit is actually the only unit in our office that has original jurisdiction that can go in without being invited. Where they would need to access and be invited is if they wanted to have, if they wanted to prosecute, they work in tandem with the local prosecutor. If the local prosecutor doesn't want to go forward for whatever reason, then we're able to, we have the right of first refusal, so we can actually prosecute if we've had a case and we felt strongly. The last one is law enforcement. They obviously are available to go in the community and the facility. I think we struggle with calling them because there's a lot of confusion around when is it civil and when it's criminal. A lot of the work that I do with law enforcement and teaching them, because I know law enforcement many times dismisses cases and they'll say it's civil if there's a power of attorney involved, or if it's a contractual issue, like they'll say, well, that's civil. And then the person gets stuck because then they try to file with APS, and then APS is like, well, this isn't civil, this is criminal. We've lost some cases, and we've left people hanging because they get trapped with, well, I did what I was supposed to do and I didn't get any help. A lot of the referrals that we get at the Elder Justice Unit are cases that is just exactly what happened. The person got stuck. So they use us to try to mediate. So one of the jobs we do is try to figure out what system is the most appropriate, and then try to reintroduce that case with some help. Sometimes we get stuck on jargon, or you're dealing with a municipality, for instance, that doesn't have resources. So because they don't have a forensic accountant, they're gonna tell that family it's civil because they don't really have the resources, and it's just, they know if they say it's civil, the person's gonna go away. So we do a fair amount of education to law enforcement to try to get them to understand what part of elder abuse is actually also criminal. And with APS, the same thing. And then we try to get them to work together because that's critical. A lot of these cases actually meet the criteria for both a civil and criminal investigation. And we typically, our minds are not wired that way. We're not wired to have them work together. We typically want it to be one or the other. So it's where I spend a lot of my time. I'm going to focus and walk you through a little bit more about what APS does, because that's what you asked me to do. So the Adult Protective Service Law in Ohio, the ORC, is real specific because that's what drives the program. And these are highlighting for you. It's in the ORC 510160 to 50163. But it does talk about, for instance, the ORC defines an adult. So when it's an adult is someone who's 60 years old. And this is a big problem. I think Ohio is only one of 3 states that does not have protective service laws for adults 18 to 59. Those cases really do fall in the cracks, and we find other resources to work with them when it comes to my attention. We have some counties, about 20 counties in Ohio will accept those cases, but they have to be on a voluntary basis, because if the person isn't 60, they're not meeting the definition of an adult. They won't be able to they can help them on a voluntary basis, but they can't force them and go to court or provide protective service, ask for a court order if the person's not 60. It focuses on a civil investigation, and its primary focus is protecting and providing protective services. And this is why I like to teach law enforcement and APS to work together, because the civil investigation should be focusing on providing protective services. Law enforcement focuses on holding the bad guy accountable. Law enforcement's not going to provide wraparound services or address the emotional distress of being a victim. I just told you that people who experience victimizations are 300 times more likely to die. There's a lot of social needs that go with being victimized. People deteriorate quickly. They experience mental health issues. They can become depressed. There's a lot that happens after they've been victimized, especially if they become aware of it. I've had patients or clients or adults that have been unduly influenced that 6 months later, once they realize what happened, go into a dark depression because all of a sudden they start blaming themselves. So it's real important that we try to look at these together, but especially with the wraparound services, because if we don't, then we're going to leave that person vulnerable to be victimized again. And that's one of the things I like to focus on. If we don't address it and provide the services to not only protect them, but it also to provide the service so they don't, there's no recidivism. The least restrictive is important because a lot of folks think of APS and of, you know, they're going to place someone in a nursing home. And actually, one of the guidance is that we try to restore, deal with the allegations as least restrictive as possible. So putting someone in a nursing home is probably the last thing APS will want to do. They also don't have the authority to do it. The person either would need to want to go, but APS by themselves do not have that authority. They do have the authority and the responsibility to petition the court. So if I felt someone needed that and they didn't want it, I have to build a case for court to get that action, because they typically will want to try to solve cases least restrictively. And you might hear sometimes your APS colleagues might use the term, people have the right to fail. That's referring to, we need proof. So if someone's being discharged from the nursing home or even the hospital, we might think that that's going to be an APS case. Sometimes you call it in, it's premature because we don't have enough evidence to support that they're not responding to the services. They've accepted the services. So we're going to need to see if that works out, and that's why it's important to communicate with the home care provider, because they are mandatory reporter. So if you had concerns about the case and the person agreed to it, they need to know what your concerns are, because if they get to the door and the person doesn't let them in, now you start having new evidence that suggests this person's at risk. But I'm just explaining to you that APS sometimes will ask you those questions when you're making that report, because I used to use the term worry referral. They're not good at dealing with worrying, because APS is not preventive. It's really an intervention. And so they have to also address and respect adults. So as I mentioned to you, people have the right to be involved in their care plan, and do they accept services or not? And we have to respect that unless we have proof that they lack capacity and maybe can again approach the court. So just because they refuse services doesn't necessarily mean they're incapacitated, because one of the things we have to prove is, what are they refusing? What are the risks? What's the harm to the individual if we don't provide the care? Those are the kinds of things probate court's going to want. So in terms of your job as a mandated reporter, this is what's interesting, because I know one of the reasons your job is to suspect it, not to have proof, but why do you suspect it is important. So are you seeing weight loss, medical appointments being missed? If you go to the home, are you seeing the home in disarray? The person's wearing the same clothes when you go there, or they're wearing like 5 outfits, or you can see that they haven't changed their depends and no one else. I mean, there has to be things for you to report that are concrete, and for you, there has to be some reasons why you're suspecting it. But once we see it, making the report is what we want you to make the call immediately to the Job and Family Services or their designee. Some of you counties that your clients live in have you're calling APS, and some counties are actually calling the designated agency. But it just needs suspicion. I think this is one of the reasons why people don't make the call. And I think sometimes people say, well, my person's competent, that's why I didn't make the report. The APS law doesn't say that as a mandated reporter, if you think someone has capacity, you don't have to make the call. It really focuses on the allegation and what's the risk to the individual. And if no action is taken, what's the likelihood of something happening? So your job is to identify it and not so much have the proof. That's what the investigation's for. The records of the APS, though, this is an important thing, is for you to know, is that it's not public record. It's not like police. It's not like probate court. They're confidential. The only information they allow you to get as a mandated, any reporter, not just mandated, who calls APS, you're entitled to know whether the case was screened in or screened out when you make the call. So I encourage all reporters, when they make the call, to ask that question. Is the case being screened in or screened out? Because that's, and the way it reads, it's actually in the Ohio Administrative Code that defines the role for APS. It actually tells them that they may tell you, meaning some of them are not going to, but if you don't ask, they're not going to. So you want to get in the habit when you're making a report to ask that question, because I think once a case is made, it gives you an idea, if they take it, you're going to feel better. But you may never be told if you don't ask. The rest of what happens with the case in terms of the investigation and the outcome, you're not going to necessarily know that. They don't have to tell you because it's protected unless you've made the report and you have a memorandum of understanding. But typically, because you're on the I team, which we're going to talk about in a second, that they're not going to tell you. This is in the Ohio, the list of the mandated reporters. As you could see, we have social workers in there, nurses, attorneys. I'm always reminding attorneys they're on the list. I know you're not part of the new group. You've always been there. Doctors too. Sometimes doctors like to tell the nurse or the social worker, like they write orders. They want to order you to make the APS report. Typically, the person who makes the report should be the one that has the most information, because typically when you make the report, they're going to ask questions. So you can make a third-hand report, but if you are making a third-hand report, you're going to want to say who actually saw it, because there's going to, it's not uncommon for us to have more questions, and actually the reporter is supposed to be consulted with after the call is made. It says in the law that in consultation with the reporter and the collateral contacts. This is the list of who was expanded, and this is important because now Ohio has an extremely extensive list of mandated reporters. The one that jumps out for me the most here is the whole banking industry, because exploitation right now is on the rise. It's probably the most allegation, the most severe one, and it's all the banks and the saving and loan credit unions. Because I've had people say, I'm in a credit union, it's the banks. I'm like, I don't know, read the law. It's all of you. The banks are listed. And it's actually interesting because the law refers to the employee. So it's not just the bank manager, but it's the teller. It's everyone who works in the bank. So we've been working a lot with the financial institutions about making reports and how to make good reports. Strongly, a lot of cases are screened out is because you don't have enough information. When you open a bank account, you don't go into all your medical history. Ohio law requires that the individual not just be 60, but to have some type of impairment, because it has to be some indication that we're concerned about their ability to protect themselves. So this list, they have to be taught not just the allegation, but how old the person is, because if they're not 60, that's a problem. If they don't live in the community, that's going to be a problem. But also if they don't have information about what type of impairments they have that keep them from protecting themselves, that could be a problem. So we have some work here, an opportunity to teach mandatory reporters how to make reports. And I use this to talk to anyone who would let me. The way the law is written, you're immune. So sometimes people don't make the reports because they're afraid they're going to be sued. Well, what if that's not true? What if the person's not being neglected? The way the APS law is written, you're protected. Matter of fact, if you make it in good faith, nothing can happen to you. There is, on the other hand, the potential of a penalty. So for not making a report, mandatory reporters can face up to a $500 fine if it's recognized and the case should have been called in and it wasn't. So, in Ohio, basically, when we talk about abuse, when we use the term abuse, it really covers physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. You can have more of one of these going on at the same time, and it happens a lot. Especially emotional abuse is usually involved whenever there's a caregiver who is or perpetrator who's perpetrating neglect or financial abuse, or physical abuse, because they're using the emotional abuse to control their victim. We did add in Ohio 2 new things. So abandonment is something that we did not recognize until 2018. So abandonment is a form of neglect where the caregiver basically takes off and leaves the individual without care, and now they're at risk. So we call in the case of abandonment. And then financial exploitation, Ohio has recently expanded that definition, because in Ohio it was restricted, the bad guy was restricted to the caretaker. And that really restricted the kind of exploitation cases being called in, because it was restricted to the person providing care who was taking the money. It didn't address someone who wasn't providing care. So some counties are screening that out. So the way the law reads now, it says basically it's a person who has a relationship with the individual So that really opened up between having the expanded list and having these two new allegations. The reports in Ohio have doubled. So last year, in the reports were hovering around 16,000, and last year the Jobs and Family Services recorded over 30,000 cases of allegations that came in. So the problem is we're getting more cases in, but I also think it's because we've opened up the criteria. So here's a polling question, and we'll see if you've been listening. So in APS in Ohio, does it have the authority to investigate cases of abuse, neglect, or exploitations of adults who are under the age of 60? Is this a true statement or a false statement? Does APS have the authority to investigate cases of people under 60? So we got 6 people, 7 people, a couple more minutes. I'm gonna let it go a couple of seconds. We got 8, so probably about half of you are responded. So I'm gonna close the poll and see the results. So we had about 40 to 60. So some of you said true, and about over 60% said false. So this is so adult protective services. It's actually covered in the definition of an adult. So APS does not have the jurisdiction to investigate cases of people who are under 60. Ohio does not have a protective service law for 18 to 59. The counties that are investigating are only able to do it on a voluntary basis. So if the person allows them to investigate, they can go forward. For instance, I worked in Cuyahoga County for many years. I know we had some under 60s. There are some counties who we will not screen anything under 60. So by law, it's under the definition of what's considered an adult. So in Ohio, for APS, the adult, the definition in the ORC defines an adult, someone who is age 60, lives in the community, and is suffering from some type of impairment that prevents them from protecting themselves. You need all 3 things to be considered an adult for APS to have the jurisdiction to investigate. So it's not just based on age, like some states. In Colorado, their age is 70, but there's no requirement of an impairment. Anyone over the age of 70 is eligible. So in Ohio, the way we wrote the law, that we really wanted to concentrate on having the vulnerabilities, because they wanted to say if you can protect yourself, it doesn't matter how old you are. If you're able to and have the means to protect yourself, then you protect yourself. APS is really targeting and wanting to help folks that meet that criteria where they're suffering from impairment, so they're not able to protect themselves. That's where we come in. And that's why it's so important for us to have information about what we think are the impairments, but why that impedes the person's ability to provide and care for themselves. It's really an important element to these cases. So this is just a slide for you to have that information. And it kind of is a reminder, and why when I do my talks and teaching folks about APS is making sure that we take the time. So to me, the answer wasn't expanding the list of mandatory reporting. To me, the answer is we need to educate folks about what is APS looking for, what's the criteria, so we make a strong report. Matter of fact, I think the report drives the investigation. The more information we give them, the more likely it is not only just to be screened in, but also to provide services. So in Ohio, this is just for you a slide that has what are we looking for. And so we definitely want to have the name of the person, but also their addresses. If you don't have an address, then you're going to want to have a proximity, because if someone's calling in about someone who's homeless, so you're going to want to have at least where they are, because that's important for them to investigate. But the approximate age is really important. So I've had, 59 and a half, they're going to say no. So it's real important that they're at least 60 years old and you, again, understand why they're vulnerable. And the most information you have, the better. That's just, again, a slide. There's a handout for this. So by the way, everything I have today, I want to make sure it's available to you by email, is the slides. And I also have a guidebook as well as the AP. This information from the state is also on a slide. The risk factors for abuse, we actually talked about this already, but I think I wanted to point out in this slide is that we used to think that cognitive impairment was the biggest factor, but we're really realizing that it's really the social isolation that makes people more vulnerable. And it's important to address isolation. And that's another reason why these wraparound services are so important in getting people engaged and getting them involved with other people. For you, when you're seeing any kind of changes, it's real important that we take a look at that and try to identify if something's going on. But changes in personality, changes in physical appearances, those are all important things that we want to use to red flags that maybe there's something going on. Signs of neglect. People, when you're seeing things, so I think people think physical abuse is easier because you're seeing signs and symptoms, bruises, the show, but physical abuse is actually not the most prevalent. It's actually right now, and it's rising as we speak. It's financial exploitation, which could be insidious, and you're not even seeing signs. But if you're seeing any type of signs, people withdrawing, family members not allowing you to visit. So we used to get calls where a family member, a new best friend, is now keeping someone from seeing someone. They can't get into the house. That's a serious sign that could be unduly influenced because the bad guy is isolating the individual, but then turning other people away. So that person becomes very dependent on that. So these are just some more signs if you're seeing in their physical, in terms of their clothes, or if they look malnourished or disoriented. So I know you know this. I just have them up there as a reminder because I think it's good to have them up there. Signs of financial exploitation, unpaid bills, new best friends, new power of attorneys, properties being changed hands. So changes in documents is another red flag that something's going on. Does the mail being redirected? Is the person no longer getting their financial statements? If someone's spending the money, why they're spending the money. The big one for me here is, who's benefiting it. As I mentioned to you, like the person with the house, if it's an unequal relationship and who's benefiting from it, it's usually a flag that something's going on. So here's another quick poll for you. So APS includes common scams as a form of elder financial exploitation. Is this true or false? APS includes common scams as a form of elder financial exploitation. Is this true or false? Here's the poll question. Are scammers and scams considered, would APS consider them? I'm going to wait a few more seconds. So I'm going to end the poll. So most of you are saying yes. Most of you are saying yes. APS would include scams. And this is actually, so it's not a trick question, but it is in the sense that it's not going to, oops, before I show that, they may not, because it depends what's going on. So the way the definition of exploitation in APS, it says a person has to be known to the individual. So where some of these scams are falling in the cracks and some of them are going undetected, and as a matter of fact, this might be an issue where you would call my office because scams typically involve law enforcement because a crime's occurring. But the relationship, the person is usually not known to the individual. It's usually a stranger and there's no relationship. You might have experiences with some of your APS counties where they're screening that case out because they're saying it's a scam, it's not exploitation. Because for APS to recognize exploitation, they want it to be a situation where the person knows the individual and there's a relationship. So how these cases can get called in is not so much, you may not call a scam in as an exploitation. You actually might call this case in as a self-neglect because of the way they're putting themselves in or demonstrating risky behavior, or they just gave away, they lost all their money, so now they can't pay for the medications, or now they're being evicted. So it might land in APS for other reasons. And so it's important, if you're getting stuck on those cases and you feel strongly, that would be a good reason to call my office. Here's a little video of, because we get a lot of calls around handyman scams and other scams.
Well, you are going to need a whole new roof. So, the next thing is I'm going to make you out an estimate with no real details on it at all. Then you're going to give me a whole lot of money up front, and then I'm going to skip town without even doing a lick of work. All right? So, go ahead and get out your checkbook. Make the check out to me, because there's nothing suspicious about that.
Unfortunately, it's never this obvious. That's why we're here, dedicated to protecting Ohio families against frauds and scams. File a consumer complaint and get the facts you need at ohioprotects.org.
So I want to share that with you because that website, ohioprotect.org, is a great resource for you or the people you work with, because it has a lot of information about what the latest scams are. It also has, if you want to sign up for a newsletter, so you can be informed about them. But that number also has the resources about how to file a complaint. Handyman scams are challenging because they can be viewed as civil if it's a contractual thing where the person's on a contract and the goods weren't provided. That's usually something that requires a civil intervention, and then versus a contractor who there used to be a saying that said one nail, no jail. If they take the money and provide no services, that's usually what's clear-cut criminal. So it's a good resource for you, but also it's also good for you to educate your victims, because some people don't they don't want to believe they were a victim. So sometimes having information and literature about what kind of scams are out there and what's going on is really to educate the person to see if we can win them over, so they realize they're a victim and they become interested in working with you. It's very difficult to work with folks who don't understand they've been victimized or a scam, and this is another area where we work closely with local municipalities. So in these cases, sometimes I get called in because not only is the office dealing with the scam, my unit is looking at other complexities, and should we be notifying APS and working with other resources and wraparound services. This is the list of more of the common scams. The one we just looked at was the handyman, but we've been doing, actually we have a new outreach with older adults, because the computer scams are common. Not only are they being reached that way, but we are trying to teach older adults how to be savvy, cyber smarts, we're calling it, because what we're learning is that they're not good at using good passwords, and they don't understanding why they want to have spyware and all those other good stuff on their computer. And so they're vulnerable to begin with because of their age, but also because they're not savvy computer users. So we do a lot of education. So if any of you are interested in this information, or if you're dealing with a victim, APS might not take one of these cases because the scammer is not in Ohio. They might be abroad. So these are cases that we actually not only work with law enforcement, we also work with the Department of Justice and the Postal Service, because there's the money being wired. These cases are trying to find out what's going on, how to stop it. It usually requires several entities working together. But it's real important we address it, because once someone's been scammed, they get put on a list. They call it a dummy list, and they get re-victimized over and over again. And that's important to stop, and then how to protect it. So if bank accounts have been compromised, to change them. But we want to, there's things that need to happen so the person's protected. And that's why I get frustrated when they get screened out, because some of these folks also have capacity issues around finances, because as you all know, you can have capacity to take care of your person. You may have issues where you have capacity issues specific to just finances, and that makes you more vulnerable. So that's important. And I end up doing a lot of work. So when we do call APS and they take the case, they're supposed to, in the way the law is written, if it's a life-threatening scenario, it's supposed to be a 24 hours. They have to go out and begin the investigation with 24 hours. When I was in Cuyahoga, we actually had a same-day policy. So if a call came in and it was meeting that situation, we would try to go out the same day or first thing in the morning, because obviously if it's life-threatening, then that could be bad. Otherwise, all other cases are usually, they're within 3 days. Weekend doesn't count. So if you call in a case on Friday, you would have the following week, because the way APS, the law ORC describes work days are Monday through Friday. So that's important to know, that most cases are non-emergency. They're supposed to have a face-to-face. Ideally, they need to meet with the individual, and not. That can get tricky, because ideally it should be in their home or a place that they're at, but sometimes, you got to do to see them. So is it good? Sometimes you have to make arrangements in the doctor's office, or where they get dialyzed, or, because you want to do a face-to-face. So where do they go and how can we see them? But you're supposed to try to do ideally a face-to-face connection to do the investigation. The law says, and this is where I want to make sure, it says consult with referent as feasible. You are allowed to make a report anonymously. I don't recommend it, because if you don't say your name and number, they can't get back to you. But the law does say that the APS worker is supposed to consult with the referent. I know when we were in Cuyahoga, that was the worker typically called the referent before they even went out to see the case, just to make sure the intake has all the information that you wanted or had, or is there a tricky way to get into the house? There's something that I should know about. That we would make an attempt to do that even before we would go out. But the law does says that it's supposed that you're supposed to be included during the investigation. And then it also says that the worker is supposed to consult with collateral contacts when feasible. So anyone or any professional has information about the allegation or what's going on should be contacted. And then they're supposed to provide the day of to the client, they're supposed to let them know the intent of the investigation. So they don't tell them who made the report, because that's confidential information. What they do have to tell them is the intent and why they're there. So this is where sometimes they figure out who made the report. So it's very specific. If you called an APS because somebody had a bruise on their head and they felt whatever, I don't know, I'm just coming up with a specific. If the nature of the report is very specific, sometimes they can guess. I as a chief supervisor got multiple calls. I don't know how many times people like, who ratted me out? So I would have to tell them that I can't tell them that information and that it's actually confidential and it's just someone who cares about you. But sometimes they were right, and sometimes I wanted to say, oh my gosh, your daughter didn't do it. You're mad at the wrong person, but I couldn't. Matter of fact, I'm trying to say I can either affirm or deny. So I have to stick with talking to them as to why we're there in our role without telling them who made the call. We basically have up to 30 days, and you can expand it 45 days to find out what's going on. So the goal of the investigation, at the end of that, we complete what's called a risk assessment. That's where we determine what are the risks to the individual. We look at their mental status, as well as we use their ADLs to figure out what their impairments are, what the risk factors are, because the goal is to determine is the allegation true, and based on the allegation and risk factors, do they have a support system? Is that the problem? Who can we bring in? So it gives you an idea of what goes on in that 30 days, trying to figure out what's going on and what we're going to do about it. Because at the end of the 30 days, we have to determine if it's valid or not. If it's valid, we use the term valid or confirm is to then develop a care plan. The protective services really should focus on the individual and really what is their needs. But protective services really means anything, any service that is needed and necessary to address an allegation and to reduce or remedy it. So it's really very broad, and it really is individualized. And according to the law, if they want services and they need the services, they should be entitled to the services. But the law is very clear that the individual is allowed to withdraw at any time. This can happen at the front door. So this is where capacity starts playing in. You make the report, I go knock on the door. Are they going to let me in or not? Because if they don't let me in, I won't be able to investigate. And for me to go to court, I'm going to need to have some proof as to why I need to get in. APS doesn't have the authority to access a home unless the person's opened the door or I get a court order. So we talked a little bit about capacity and competency. In the APS law, there is not one time mentioned the word competent. What it talks about is incapacitated and having a definition for what's an incapacitated person. And incapacitated is different than competency because, as I mentioned to you earlier, this is a competent person can be incapacitated. So I always tell people when you're being asked on the phone if the person's competent, don't answer that question. What you should be saying, especially if you have concerns about decision making or insight, is I don't know because this is what I'm seeing. So you use this. I know for a fact that some of the smaller counties literally screen cases out because if you say the person is competent, some of these counties that don't have a lot of resources might use that to screen it out. So I don't answer that, or you shouldn't answer that unless, and besides, we're all competent unless the judge says we're not. So that's kind of an invalid question. And here's just a definition of incompetent. They're very similar, only the difference is that incompetent, this person's been adjudicated in front of a judge, which is another reason why I don't want you to answer that question, because unless you're a judge and you've determined someone's legally incompetent, the person's actually competent. What you're really questioning is their capacity to make good decisions and provide for themselves. And APS will need that information, and capacity with drives, it's one of the elements of whether or not APS can go to court and get a court order. So and the level of proof is just as high as it is for guardianship. So it's beyond clear and convincing. So we have to have a person who we believe have a validated case. So we can't go to court unless we've done an investigation. We know they need protective services and no one's agreeing, they're not agreeing. All these things have to be in place for us to present a case in court. The judge basically gives us what we want. So APS could use court orders to try to get into a house. So the person didn't let me in. I can, if I have enough facts, I can go to court. And this is the access order is probably one where I'm going to need your help, because if you have information about the individual, I don't have any evidence. I might need you to provide me some assistance so I can get a court order about the threat to the individual. Temporary restraining order, that one is when someone wants help, but there's someone interfering. And this is actually common with older adults. The son or daughter or their perpetrator is the one that's interfering with the care. I might get an order to have them remove their ability they're interfering with the investigations. I want them removed. The other three on the bottom are really about when I want a court order. I mentioned to you, I don't have the authority to place someone in a nursing home, but I might use a general protective service order, for instance, to get someone evaluated to find out if they're competent. I might use that because someone is refusing medical care, they're refusing dialysis or whatever. I have used those orders when I can show and demonstrate the person is in fact a validated case and they need assistance. And so the hearing is very similar to a guardianship hearing if you've ever been to a hearing. And based on the facts that are presented, the judge or magistrate gives APS the authority to move forward and in essence deems the person incapacitated. So APS in many ways becomes the legal decision maker. This slide is just reminding you, every one of you should have your county's APS has to have by law an I-team, which meets on a regular basis around challenging cases. These are very important because most of these cases require multiple disciplines working together. I-teams are great bringing the resources together and bringing our resources, teaching each other about what we can and cannot do, and trying to focus on the victim, and we can come together to address the situation. So there's a lot of benefits to I-teams. I was very much involved in the one in Cuyahoga. I actually still participate in it. And I think it's where I learned a lot, and I still learn and continue to learn about what resources are available and what the gaps are and how can we work together. So we're working together and not blaming each other and pointing fingers. So my last two slides are basically reminding you, if we don't get involved and we believe the investigator, that's usually not good for the victim. So we want to focus on what the victim needs and not what the abuser is doing in order to hold them accountable. In terms of resources, I mentioned the Attorney General, particularly the Elder Justice Unit. So I think we can actually be a navigator for you. So we can help you navigate through the different systems. One is at APS, one is a long-term care, but you can also access these organizations yourself. So I know I went a little bit over and I apologize, but it is a lot of information. Hopefully I didn't go too fast, but I wanted to give you a chance to see if you have any questions. Any questions?
I'm going to throw one out. Sorry, I've got an echo.
That's okay.
Part of the reporting talked about sort of there has to be evidence of an impairment.
There has to be, you have to suspect an impairment, but go on.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking about people, because it talked about changes in behavior, changes in appearance, changes, like people who aren't necessarily familiar. Is there a screen or something that could be recommended if they suspect something's going on, but they don't know if it represents a change?
So because you're new to the individual, and so that's hard. You're right. So if you don't have a baseline because it's your first visit, so it's really, is there collateral information that can help you determine what their baseline is? If you don't know, I would go use your, so I'm old enough and been working long enough. I remember I was taught a long time ago, you're not supposed to take your judgment to the door. You're supposed to, you may not live like that, but people have the right to live a certain way. I think we have to use some, I think when you walk in and you see a situation that doesn't look right, so you don't know the person, but the situation doesn't look right because of the, they don't have enough clothes or there's not enough food in the refrigerator. So you could make, it's not a change, but it doesn't look like there's enough there for them to be safe. So I would rather have you err on the side of what problems are you seeing that you have concerns about that person to be able to take care of themselves. So whether it's the way they're dressed, the way they're, when you're speaking to them, they're not able to, follow you and answer the questions. They appear to be confused. I mean, you're right. If it's a new situation, you may be able to find out from people that know the individual and see what the changes are. Otherwise, I think you want to assess what are you seeing and what you think the risk factors are from what you're seeing. Hopefully that helps. There are some guides. I can probably send them to Denise and get it out to you guys. But there's a couple different screens, but I don't think there's, some have the validity rate isn't. I think Benjamin Rhodes created one, risk of abuse, that I can probably send it to you guys.
Great, thanks.
That's a good question. I'd rather you err on the side of making the call than not. And when I say giving information as to why, if the person looks disheveled, again, the condition of the home, is it clean? Does it smell? Were they alone? If someone lives with them, and so if they have a caregiver and you see these have concerns, it's like you can start wondering, is this caregiver providing enough care?
There's a question in the chat box.
Sure.
What is a mandated reporter to do if the person you suspect is being abused states they're going to deny everything if you make a report and won't let anyone in?
So that's where you make the report based on your concerns. If you don't think they're going to let them in, this is where APS might be able to, if they knock on the door and they don't let them in, they're going to try, like most organizations have like a timetable. They'll like try 3 times. They'll try to go different days to try to see if they get in. If they can't get in, the next step is, do they need to get an access order? So to get an access order, I might need evidence. If I haven't gotten in the house, I don't have evidence, then I might need a collateral contact, whether it's a statement from the person who knows. So we've gotten court orders with family members cooperating and providing evidence, or neighbors, or just, we need to somehow, to get an access order, you need to be able to plead the case as to why you believe you need to get in. So I was able to get access orders successfully. Sometimes it was a case I had in the past, so that's easier because I already have this case and I can show and demonstrate that, you know, the risks are growing based on the intake. But if we didn't have history with the case, we're going to need our information from collateral contacts. I remember one time I had a case where thank God for the Animal Protection League actually ended up helping us, because they had gotten calls about the animals. We had gotten calls about the older adult, and he couldn't open the door and she was leaving him alone. But how we were able to get a court order is that the Animal Protection was able to get the cats out, I believe it was. And because of the conditions that they saw our guy, they saw the house, you know, they were able to get in easier, because apparently you know, the cats don't have civil rights. They can go in. But he became instrumental to us. He actually came with us to court. I remember that because he came with us and basically testified to the conditions of the home. And that's how we were able to get a court order to get an access to get into the house. And eventually we were able to get our guy out of there. The perpetrator was bad. She was neglecting him and neglecting the animals. But I remember that case because how we got in is the Animal Protective League, and now they're mandated reporters. That was actually before they were required. That guy called us because he was really torn with what he saw and wanted to do something. But now they're mandated reporter, and there's a big connection between older adults and their animals, and I'm glad they're mandated reporters now. So hopefully that helped you a little bit. So the last slide I wanted to make sure you have is my my email address and my phone number, because you may have a case or a question that comes up after today. I do want to make sure you have a copy to our PowerPoint, because I know I resent it this morning. Hopefully they can send it out to you by email, along with a guide that the Jobs and Family Services put out that I think is a nice guide that walks people through what is APS. Included a palm card about the Elder Justice Unit, because we are here. So if you have questions about cases, sometimes I get questions as a consult, so they don't go into the details of the case. They just want to, you know, they review it with me as a consult, which is fine. Sometimes I recommend that we open it, because that way I'm able to help with making referrals within the office as well as local resources. So it's a good resource for you, especially when you're dealing with a complicated case that you either haven't had any success, or you have a case that you've tried making a report and hasn't been accepted, or you've tried to make a report with police. So the help number, that actually is a central number, and we have 33 different sections. So if you call in and you talk about an older adult, they're going to send it to the Elder Justice Unit, or you can just specifically ask for the Elder Justice Unit. If you want to ask me or send me an email, I'm more than happy to help. So want to make sure you have it.
I'm curious about one other thing.
Sure.
Do you have any numbers on like the number of older adults who refuse, say a referral is made and they, you know, they refuse your services or they turn you away?
Do we have numbers? So right now, Jobs and Family Services does have a new database, and there's better data collection now than there's ever been, and they're keeping track of cases that are screened in, but they're also keeping track of cases that are being screened out, and then why they're being screened out. So Jobs and Family Services, I can probably get you that information, or at least how to get it. But if you made the report, I'm going to highly recommend again and remind you, if you make a report, you want to ask that question: is this case being screened in? If you made the report, some of the counties will let you know the case was, like Cuyahoga still sends out a letter that tells you the case was screened in, and it actually tells you who the worker is. But I would encourage you, if you made the report, to reach out to them to find out if it was screened in, and then if it was, to talk to the worker because you made the report. As the reporter, as I mentioned to you, the law is pretty clear about APS is, in theory, supposed to be speaking with you about the case when it's in the investigation phase. So making a home visit together if you want to, or talk. And then I also would encourage you to make contact with them about their I-teams, because the interdisciplinary teams are meeting, and the cases that they usually discuss at the meetings are cases that are difficult and complicated. So some of you might have cases that may be presented at the I-team. So the I-team's APS interdisciplinary team is a good resource for you, especially if you want to get to know your APS and who they are and what they do, but for them to also to get to know you, because I've learned from experience that it's easier to collaborate with someone you know versus someone you've never met. Okay, so hopefully this met your needs, and you can find me if you have any other questions. Like I said, I'm pretty open to helping you if a case comes up, and it's probably easier for me to help you with a specific case and we can strategize. I'm pretty easy to reach, and I am working remotely, like some of you with this COVID, but I try, I am available to you, so please keep my contact.
Thank you very much, Sylvia.
You're welcome.
Slide recording will be sent out after I get it processed.
Okay.
Along with the follow-up survey. So if everybody can take a chance to complete that, that'd be great.